Our next question comes from Mini Monkey, who says, if you could, what would you change to the UFC rules? Would you bring back the UFC 1 rules? Man, that's an interesting prospect. I would like to see UFC 1 rules with modern UFC fighters. I think that would be really educational. I don't know if it would be something I would want to see forever, but I would want to see it at least once or twice. Would I change the gloves? Would I put rash guards on fighters to make them less slippery? No, I wouldn't do that. The first thing that I would change about the rules of the UFC is the rounds. I would get rid of the rounds. Rounds are a boxing tradition. It's a stupid idea in my opinion. Why would I get rid of the rounds? It's a well-intentioned rule brought about in the sport of boxing way back when that was supposedly in the best interest of the fighters to give them time to recover between beatings so they could go back and take another beating and get more brain trauma. And bringing this tradition into MMA, what does it do? It breaks up the fight. It disrupts the action. How many fights have you seen where a fighter, he was beaten within an inch of his life, he's on the mat, he's about to get knocked out or submitted, or, he's in a bad spot and he will lose if there was just a little bit of time on the clock, but there's not, and the buzzer rings, and he's saved, and he goes to his corner, and he gets a temporary reprieve, and then he comes back, and the fight continues, and sometimes he gets that Rocky-like comeback, and the audience is like, oh, this is the best thing ever, what a war! And then his career is shortened by years. Because of all the resultant brain damage. It's like high school football, or college football, American football. I'm not talking about soccer. American football. If you've never seen it, go something like this. You put on a set of armor, you got a team of people out there, they run at each other, they crash into each other, and they get concussed, but not knocked unconscious, and then they go sit on the bench for a little bit, they take a little bit of a break, the coach sends them back in, boom, they smash into each other again, and some people love it because people love violent action, but the brain doesn't love it. And so these guys take concussion after concussion after concussion after concussion multiple times in the same game. And CTE, man, CTE. If you don't know what that means, look it up. So I would get rid of the rounds. Why? Because it essentially has that same effect. It allows a fighter who is being concussed to come back and do it again. But isn't the referee supposed to stop the fight if a fighter can no longer intelligently defend himself? Well, yeah, that's what he's supposed to do. But how many times have you seen an MMA fight that looks like this? A guy takes a punch on the jaw, he goes down, he falls down, but he's not unconscious. The other guy leaps on top of him, throws some punches, the guy on the bottom comes back to life, and the fight continues for some time, and a whole bunch of punches land to the head of that guy. Whereas the fight probably would have been stopped if the standing fighter would have just walked away right after the drop, like Mark Hunt was so famous for doing. So what's happening there? Especially if the bell rings and the guy gets the reprieve, especially that time incentive. Like, oh man, I've only got 10 seconds left in the round. I dropped him. I have to finish this. I'm going to jump on here and boom, 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 ding. Oh man, now he gets a break. And in that break interval, that 1 minute break, the guy gets steady, he gets back up on his feet. But the brain doesn't repair itself in 1 minute. That's impossible. It doesn't repair itself in a month. It doesn't repair itself in a year. Not like that. If you're not familiar, in a lot of states in the United States, a fighter's license will be revoked for 30 days in the instance of a knockout, which is a pretty smart thing because you don't want multiple repeated concussions within short periods of time. It's not like that everywhere. But the best athletic commissions have at least that rule on the books. So yeah, I would get rid of the rounds. It would make the sport a lot more honest, for one thing, and MMA is supposed to be the most honest combat sport. It is. And putting a 1 minute break every 5 minutes is just silly. It's silly, and I think one of the reasons they added that is because the early UFCs were boring because they had essentially terrible athletes competing, and these guys would gas out in these long, endless, no time limit rounds and just plod around like and people are like, maybe it's not the worst thing in the world to give them a break, but modern fighters are incredible athletes. Take out the rounds. They can handle a 15-minute round, a 15-minute round. I would like to see that. Instead of 3 5s, 1 15-minute round. And get rid of the 10-point must system. That's another boxing tradition. Really, just get rid of the boxing traditions that have been carried over into the sport of mixed martial arts. Get rid of the boxing traditions. The 10-point must system, it's weird. I understand why it exists, because it exists to ensure that most of the time there is a winner and not a draw, but we still end up with draws regardless, even with the 10-point must system, but it's weird. It's weird. What would I replace it with? I'm not exactly sure. There are a lot of different organizations that score fights differently. For example, ONE FC tallies up every little combative movement. The UFC doesn't. It's very subjective. Probably because the promoter wants to reserve the right to tip the scales of a controversial decision in whichever direction makes the most money at the end of the day. Would I change the gloves? I would like to see MMA without gloves. I'd like to see it. No gloves, no wraps. Well, almost like the original UFC. Some guys would tape up their hands. Some guys wore gloves in those old UFCs. Take out the gloves entirely. Make it a more honest expression of self. Take away the opportunity to recklessly throw punches that would otherwise break your hands. And force fighters to come up with more intelligent game plans to preserve the structural integrity of their fists. It might be more boring, it might be more exciting, but I would like to see it for a meaningful amount of time. Rash guards, no, that's just silly. Being slippery, it's just part of the sport, man. It's part of the sport. People sweat. And forcing a fighter to put on clothes like a rash guard or a gi or something to take away the slipperiness of it, it's silly. It's not jiu-jitsu, guys. MMA was never meant to be jiu-jitsu. Some of you might argue with me on that and say UFC 1 was meant to be an advertisement for Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Well, sure. Okay, you got me there. Touche. So that's what I would change. Get rid of the rounds. Get rid of the 10-point must system. Oh yeah, the 12-6 elbow rule. Just get rid of that. Get rid of that. What else? Kicks, knees, and stomps to the head of a downed fighter. I understand why that rule exists. I understand that it keeps, in theory, keeps fighters safe, but at the same time, it turns the sport into something else. So I would like to see fights change. I have competed. I'm not just saying this because I like to see blood in the ring. I've competed under that rule set a number of times. Man, when I first started fighting in China, kicks, knees, and stomps to the head of downed opponents were okay. And it wasn't the end of the world. What did we do? We modified our game plans around it. That's what any intelligent fighter does. If there's a change in the rules, you modify your game plan around it so you don't get hurt. It's pretty simple. What would you change in the UFC rules if you could? Thanks for watching. Now get out there and train.